Hello A&P1 students. This video we are going to get started talking about anatomy and physiology. So I have a little cartoon here because I know that some students feel a little bit of stress when they start their anatomy and physiology course. They probably heard things about it and gets them a little bit worried. And I think primarily it's because it is a rigorous course. It is a course that you have to spend time on to understand and learn the material. But if you make a commitment to spend that time to learn the material, it'll be very rewarding. It's really, I think, the body and all of its processes are pretty amazing, and it kind of makes you feel a little empowered to understand how some of the parts of the body work. So I picked this cartoon for this video because I love dogs, and so and one of the reasons I love dogs is because they do reduce stress. So I have 3 dogs of my own. I love other animals too, but dogs are my favorite. I have 2 cats as well, and 2 guinea pigs, and I've had other animals over the years too. So, okay, so we are going to jump to the objectives. So these are the kind of the study guide for your for the lecture part, and you'll want to use this as a study guide. These objectives, I call them. Because there is some information in the chapter that we will not cover, or maybe not cover as in depth. So you want to kind of effectively kind of focus on what you need to know and what you'll be quizzed and tested on. You want to make sure you know this information that's in these objectives. The same thing will go with lab. Lab also has, they call it a lab packet, but it's essentially your study guide for lab. So you'll learn about identifying a lot of parts of the body and parts of the different structures like the bones and the muscles. And so you want to make sure that you follow that study guide. If you try to just look at your textbook and learn everything they have labeled in the textbook, which is fine, you can do that, but there's going to be some of that information we won't actually quiz and test you on. So to be more effective, you want to make sure you follow the lab packet in lab and follow these objectives in lecture. Okay, so we're going to start with the first objective, just defining anatomy and physiology. And this is in the very first chapter. So let me pull up that chapter. So the first 5 chapters kind of just talk about the basics of anatomy and physiology and how the human body is organized. The anatomy part, when we say anatomy, we're talking about the structures. So we're talking about naming this bone, or we're talking about naming that type of cell, whether it's like a neuron or a red blood cell. So we're mainly focused on identifying the parts. And then sometimes we'll also talk about how those parts relate in position to other parts of the human body too. So you'll do that more in lecture. So anatomy, a lot of that is more focused in the lecture part. You will have some anatomy a lot of that anatomy is focused in the lab part. You will have some of that anatomy though in the lecture, but the majority of the anatomy comes from the lab, and that's where you'll get that information. Now, that doesn't mean that the lab and lecture don't complement each other. They do, because if you don't really understand the anatomy and don't understand what the parts are called and where they're located, then it's like really difficult, almost impossible to understand how they work. And that's the physiology part. So the physiology part is how those particular parts of the body actually function. So that's, and again, physiology, we mainly focus in it. It's going to be the main focus in the lecture part. So you might get a little bit in lab, but most of it's going to be in the lecture portion. So that is the definition of anatomy and physiology that you should be familiar with. All right, so for we break down, there's like sub topics for the anatomy and for the physiology. So when we talk about anatomy, we can talk about and identify things that we can see without a microscope. So see with they say you can see it or it's visible with the unaided eye, just means you don't need a microscope. So they call that gross anatomy. So like you can see your humerus bone, you can see the pinna of your ear, you can see the iris of your eye. So those are all things that you don't need a microscope to see those. But the other part of anatomy is the microscopic anatomy, and so that's where you need a microscope. You can't see it without a microscope. So that's more like the smaller structures, mainly cells. That's what we look at under the microscope. We can look at structures even smaller than cells, and we usually do that with pictures because we don't have a microscope that's that powerful. But so mainly we're going to be like looking at the cells and identifying their smaller parts on models and things like that. But that's the microscopic part. So we do have two kind of big subcategories under anatomy. So they're gross and microscopic anatomy. And so this is, I'll kind of try to, there we go, follow along through the chapter. So we have the microscopic anatomy and the gross anatomy. Oh, here's gross, sorry. So I kind of did them in reverse order. But so they talk about gross anatomy and then microscopic anatomy. So you should know the difference between those two. Then when it comes to, I'm going to do gross anatomy first. When it comes to gross anatomy, then there's going to be these different ways that we look at gross anatomy. So we may look at it as a system. So we may look at a body system, so that might be like the cardiovascular system or the renal system, the integumentary system, which is our skin. We may look at like all the structures in them. So since we're looking at everything in a system, then they'll call it systemic anatomy. If we're looking at like one region of the body, so maybe we're just looking at the hand, or we're just looking at the abdomen or just the head and all the structures associated with those areas or regions, we'll call it regional anatomy. And then surface anatomy has to do with the structures that are underneath the skin that you can actually locate by underneath the skin. So we can the spine of your scapula. That's something that you can feel that spine along the back. It's prominent and there's not a large amount of skin over it, so you can feel that pretty easily. People are really familiar with because a lot of people do this, that we call it our shin bone, but that's actually the tibia that's on the inside of our lower part of our leg, and that has not a lot of tissue over it, so you can actually feel that on the front of your lower leg, that little bony prominence that you're kind of feeling the margin of the tibia. And that one I figured most people might be familiar with, because a lot of people like hit that on something and it hurts really bad, and the reason it hurts really bad is because there's nothing kind of cushion it, so you actually hit the bone and we got nerves in that bone, so it hurts pretty bad. So those are some of the common surface anatomy. So we'll talk about that mainly in lab again, since we're talking about anatomy here. And then comparative anatomy, we don't do a lot of comparative anatomy, but you should be familiar with that. That's just comparing the anatomy between different species. So we focus mainly on the human anatomy and physiology, but realize that other species have similar systems and organs and structures, and they will kind of do the same thing function wise and maybe look the same, but they can also look a little bit different too and have a little bit different function. So whenever you're comparing species, we call that comparative anatomy. So since I'm a veterinarian, You might get a little bit of that in this human anatomy and physiology course, because I do sometimes talk about animals and how they differ from the humans too. So so that's called comparative anatomy, just comparing the anatomy and physiology between, actually and this is just the anatomy between these different species. And then embryology, that's the study of the changes that an embryo, human embryo, is going to go through as it changes and develops into a human being. So that's called embryology. So those are some of our kind of areas, categories underneath gross anatomy. So we'll break it down into these other specializations or categories. And then microscopic anatomy. This one is, so we did gross anatomy, so this is objective 3. Talked about systemic, regional, surface, comparative embryology, just knowing the definitions. A lot of this first part of the chapter 1 is just definitions. And then the microscopic anatomy, when we're looking at stuff underneath the microscope that we can't see without a microscope, we'll break it down into, if we're looking at the whole tissue, so like if we're looking at the whole muscle tissue, and that's going to be tissue is anything that has more than one cell, many cells that do have the same function. So muscle tissue would be an example of that. If we're looking at the whole tissue, then we call that histology. So if we're studying the tissues. Now sometimes we will just look at the cells that are in the tissues and just look at the cells themselves. And so if we do that, they call that cytology. So cytology, some examples of when you would look at cells, just cells themselves. If you have like a growth of some type on the skin, a needle aspirate can be done, where you put a needle in there and you draw out, kind of pull on the plunger, and you can kind of suck up some cells from that area and put it on a slide, and then you can look at just the cells. That's mainly, you don't get the whole tissue out, you just get some of the cells out, and you can look at those cells and see if you can determine what's causing that growth that's there. So that's called cytology. Histology, mainly when you do that, you're taking a biopsy. So maybe you have again, like a skin tumor, somebody goes in and they actually take like a whole sample from that growth, and then you're looking at the whole tissue as a whole. So they call that histology. So some of that can be done, in a doctor's office. Sometimes it's sent out to people that are called pathologists that actually look at those samples, and they have a better knowledge of what's normal and abnormal, and they can give a good diagnosis of maybe what's going on. So, all right, so that is our first 3 objectives. So the next video, we're going to talk about a couple more divisions or subdivisions of anatomy, and then we'll talk about subdivisions in physiology too. We'll probably get to some of these others as well. So I will see you in the next video.